Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. It's Gretchen Rowe, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this episode of the Demi Learning Show. Today, I'm very privileged to be joined by Kim Kautzer, author and original publisher of the Write Shop curriculum. We are so fortunate to now have Write Shop available to the Demi Learning family. And today, I've asked Kim to join me and talk about the art of teaching creative writing. You know, with homeschool parents and even teachers, this is right up there next to public speaking and running through the streets in your underwear as far as being uncomfortable in guises, because it's a subjective value, is it not? And Kim's been so gracious to join me today. I'm so excited, and I'm going to let her introduce herself, and then we're going to get into the meat of this conversation, which I think you'll find truly enjoyable. Kim, let's get started.
Well, I am the founder of Write Shop. I retired at the end of 2021. And I'm so thankful that Demi Learning has picked up the pieces of Write Shop and is carrying it forth with gusto. I homeschooled for 15 years, my 3 children, graduated all 3 of them from our homeschool, although I didn't start homeschooling until my oldest was entering 5th grade. So I had a little bit of a later start in that. Homeschooling wasn't very popular at the time that I began in the late 80s. And so they've all graduated from homeschooling. They've got kids of their own. I have 9 grandchildren. What else do you want to know?
Well, Kim, tell us a little bit of how you came to create Write Shop. Important. This really is a larger context conversation about teaching creative writing, but I also think it's great for people to understand how you saw a need and filled it.
Well, I mentioned that I had 3 kids, and my girls were the older 2. And when I started homeschooling, they were just so easy to teach and motivated and strong students, and they could work independently. And Ben was still too young, and when he got to be school age, he just struggled, and with all the 3 R's. And by the time he was 12, my friend and I, Debbie, we had just decided that we had to do something to help shape the writing skills of these 12-year-old boys who were struggling so much. They just could not write. So for some reason, we thought that by teaching a writing class that was going to somehow be different from homeschooling our kids. But now we were having to teach writing to 14 children who could not write as any better than our sons. The material we picked for the class just from day one was not working. There wasn't much available this was like in the late 90s. There was just not a lot available in terms of teaching writing. And when we found out it wasn't just our boys, we thought we're committed to teach these kids for the whole year. So basically, we canceled class for a few weeks, scrapped our lesson plans that we worked on all summer, and started from scratch. And, we'd made a commitment to these parents. We had to take a detour and do something to get these kids writing. But we didn't set out to write a curriculum. That was not on the forefront. On the forefront was our struggling sons and this little group of kids in my family room who were struggling to put pencil to paper. And, it's like, Debbie and I were just happy by midnight on Monday night to have hammered out a lesson that we could teach on Tuesday. And within weeks, we started discovering we were onto something. Writing finally started clicking for these kids. And for every one of them, at some level, no matter how hard they struggled, we were seeing improvement. And so one thing led to another. We fought publishing. Eventually, we did. We self-published. Things were improving, growing. We found a local printer. We eventually added levels. We started selling worldwide and to schools and co-ops and homeschool families alike. And it's just been a blessing to see the fruit of our work over the last 25 years as we've watched family after family find success.
I think this is kind of like Field of Dreams, if you build
Yeah.
it, they will come. And if you
You
create it,
build it.
homeschoolers will find it. And I have to
Yes.
tell you, it has been such a joy to have our Right Shop affiliation and watch families who have struggled with multiple curricula and find their way to Right Shop and say, you mean we can set the parameters for what our children will write about, and what a blessing that is. And I think you found in that group of boys the single populace that has the hardest time with expressing themselves. It really is true. So I know we have a lot of parents who are joining us today just from the questions I see parents asking who are in that very same position. So I think we've got a really rich foundation of information to share with them today. And I wonder if, in just before we really launch into this, if you could tell your son's story and where he ended up as far as writing is concerned, because I think this is very inspirational and I love to tell it, but I'd rather hear you tell it.
I love Ben's story. It to me is just such an amazing, I don't know, just watching what happened through his life. So Ben was a smart kid. I mean, he did not have a problem remembering things, talking about things. He loved to learn, he loved to explore. He was a real hands-on learner, but he could not read a word. He couldn't put pencil to paper. He couldn't do a math problem. And as he got older, I just kept trying new things, new products, new curricula to see, okay, maybe this will work. Maybe that'll be the thing. But he just really struggled. And in my way of teaching my kids, I was kind of a hands-on teacher, and I'm not trained as a teacher. So you need to know up front that everything that I know and do, I learned as I was going down the rapids without an oar. Um, so with Ben, I discovered that if I did not write down the words that he was telling me, I would have no record of his cognitive abilities when he was 5 or 7 or even 10 or 12 years old. All the things he knew, all the ways that he could communicate, the words that he used, his vocabulary was amazing. He just couldn't put those words down himself. Long story short, I scribed for him for years, literally years, until he was in high school. And it took him, I was still working on handwriting and working on getting him to write, but there were steps involved. It wasn't like he went from me scribing to suddenly he was typing, 5-page papers. We were doing it slowly and gradually. He would copy what I wrote, or I would write a sentence and he would write a sentence. We would talk about things. We did them together. It was time consuming, yes, but the fruit was so good. So fast forward, he's now in the Right Shop class. He's learning the skills. He's able to dictate to me. I'm writing for him. He's gradually moving out of it. Now he's in high school. And suddenly, somewhere in the middle of high school, a combination of puberty and Right Shop and just having different experiences. He was an Eagle Scout. So all these things were contributing. He was in debate, speech and debate, even though he still wasn't a great writer. And that was another story. But long story short, because it is a much longer one, he found his expression. And he was by this time reading pretty strongly. And so when he went to college, he was able to go straight into four-year university without having to do anything remedial. He ended so strong in high school. And now he's 38 and he's a pastor in England. He has a PhD, which, that's the thing that it's like, what? He asked me Mom, can you look over my dissertation? Well, it was, 300 pages long. And I said, I can promise you this. I can look for typos. Um, I can look for spelling words, but I can't address the content on too many levels because it's too cerebral for me. So he finally found a way to take what he knew in his head and he could express it. And he makes a living, as much of a living as a pastor can make, writing and speaking and sharing in so many different ways. And I just like to encourage parents that what you see when your child is 5 or 7 or 10 doesn't mean that's who they're always going to be. And you work with them in the way you best know how. He had some learning issues that we had to work with as well. And we taught him to accommodate, and that's part of what the scribing was. And so here we are.
That's right. And the reason I wanted you to tell that story is because there's a mama sitting out there right now with a child who is 12, 13, 14, 16 years old, and thinking he or she should be doing this, paddling with the oar by themselves, and they're not. And one of the reasons we homeschool is because we want to be able to give our children a different experience than what they would have in the public school. And I think what you've said is really, really valuable. You equip them and come alongside them and aid them until they're ready to aid themselves. And I wanted you to tell Ben's story because I think it's just a terrific one. And I want parents to know that this is part of your journey as well. You don't know where your child's going to land. It's just up to us to be the lift under their wings until they can fly for themselves. And I think that's really important.
I love that, Gretchen.
I want you to tell me about, you gave me an analogy from Benjamin Elkins in The Big Jump. You talked about this book and about how we as parents kind of want to see it one way. And I want you to tell the story because I think I have thought about this nonstop since you talked about it. I have to tell the story.
So I like analogies and I like stories that help us relate to a life situation. And The Big Jump is one of those early readers that's in the Dr. Seuss type series that you can get. And it's a story in one of the books. It had 3 stories. I don't remember the others, but that was the one that just I have always remembered. But it wasn't until maybe 10 years ago or so where I connected that story with writing. So in this story, there's a kingdom, and a young boy finds a stray dog and he wants to keep the dog. But the problem is, in this particular land, only the kings are allowed to own dogs. And so the king, who, by the way, had this gift of being able to spring from the ground to the top of his castle in a single leap, he promises the boy that he can keep the pup on one condition. He has to be able to jump to the top of the castle. So the boy is motivated because he really wants this dog and he wants to be the first in the kingdom to own a dog besides the king. So he tries and he can only scale 1 box and then maybe 2 boxes. But he's watching his dog bound up and down the boxes, and suddenly he gets this idea. So he goes back to the palace and he finally succeeds in jumping to the top. Well, how did he do this? So that was the question. The king told him he had to jump to the top of the castle, but he never told him he had to do it in 1 leap. So the boy, in his cleverness and watching his dog, does it 1 step at a time, slowly up the stairs until he gets to the top. And so the king is thrilled by the boy's out of the box approach, even though all his friends are saying, that's not fair. You told him he had to jump to the top. And the king said, Yes, I did. I just didn't tell him he had to do it in one leap. And writing is a lot like this. Our kids want to make the big jump from the blank paper to the final draft all in one leap. But our goal is to help them realize that when they take smaller steps, they can see that they can do it inch by inch. And in the end, then they will have the goal of a polished writing project. But they don't get there on the first leap.
Therein is the truth of why writing is often so difficult as a parent, because we want them to be done too. We would like that first draft to be the final draft because we have a million things to do. But a great writer is made, not born. And you have to repeat the steps to learn how to do this effectively. And one of the things I'm excited about is this week's show notes are going to contain some of the blogs that were part of the Write Shop materials that really take parents through everything from a writer's block to games to help kids build stronger sentences. And I'm excited to include those blogs in the show notes because I think they're going to help. But one of the things we talked about, Kim, is how writing is an expression of inner thoughts and ideas. And when we write creatively, we get to apply that, but it's not something that it happens overnight. So can you talk a little bit about that step-by-step process? What are elements of that for kids to understand and maybe for parents to understand as well?
Creative writing, the more we do it, the easier it becomes, right? Like with anything else, and I can go down the analogy trail and talk about scrapbooking or playing soccer, playing a musical instrument. The more we do it, the better we get. But you may be thinking, well, my kid doesn't like creative writing. My kid he just likes the facts. He just wants to, he doesn't want to have to use bigger, fun words. He doesn't want to look things up in the thesaurus. He just wants to write and be done. And figurative writing is an important part of any kind of writing. And that's taught largely through the creative writing process. So whether your child is writing a description or a narrative, something that involves emotion or observation, they're going to need to make stronger word choices. So their vocabulary is going to grow. They have a bigger speaking vocabulary than they do a writing vocabulary. You need to help them grow that writing vocabulary. Creative writing is one outlet. Another reason we want our kids to write creatively is it kind of helps to stretch those writing muscles. It helps them. It's foundational to future writing. So when they're going to write a report, if they've not learned creative writing, the report's going to be dull. If they learn to infuse it with interesting words and expressive ways of saying things, that all happens in the the learning pad of creative writing. So I don't necessarily lump reports into that category, but I think it's just a foundation.
So Kim, are readers writers and writers readers?
We hear that. And certainly reading helps. And the kids that I know who are strong readers do tend to be better writers. But just because you can read doesn't mean you know how to translate that author's skill to your own. And so it helps in many ways in helping understand the lilt of how words are expressed and the cadence of writing. And but you're still going to have to learn and still going to have to practice. So I think they go hand in hand, but one does not necessarily guarantee the other.
Okay. I like the way that you said that. One doesn't necessarily guarantee the other, but you have a higher probability of having success with both.
Yes.
If you engage in both of them. So what's the perfect age to begin a creative writing experience?
I used to say before we had Red Shot Primary and Junior, that because I was teaching middle schoolers and high schoolers, and they were coming to me mostly unable to write. There were a few, and there were those who were like all over the place, but they needed reining in. But I was thinking that kids just needed to be older, to like third grade. And then I started to discover that writing is not all physical pencil to paper, that writing is the idea generating process. And that is where it begins. And whether your child is able to put the ideas down on paper, type them out independently is fine and great. But if they're 5 or 7 or 8 and they are weak in their handwriting skills, but verbal, then you want to teach them to develop the creativity. So writing starts with a lot of conversation and modeling and letting your kids dictate to you from the earliest age, even if it's just simple sentences, and teaching them by your conversation. That's so important. Modeling and talking about ideas and asking questions: who, what, when, where, why. Those are the best questions that you can ask in almost any situation when you can't get your kids to come up with more information. And you can start that when they're very young and start keeping record of those cute little stories when they're 4. And as they mature, then they're writing more on their own. Then those are, they're just developing the skills.
One of the things that we did with my children, and this will tell you how long ago we were a homeschool family, is they had handheld cassette recorders. And that was where they started the stories that they wrote. They would tell the story into the cassette recorder, and then we would play it back and they would write it down. Parents who hear me speak from stage often hear me say, don't put your phone away when you're teaching, but your phone is a valuable tool if you're trying to get a reluctant writer to capture their thoughts. You can open up an email and you can hit that microphone button and say, tell me a story. And we forget that creative writing is the single most complex process we ask of kids when we homeschool them, because they have to think about how to hold the pencil, and they have to think about what they want to say, and they have to think about how they spell what they want to say, and do they have the right sentence structure? And it can be overwhelming. So if, as parents, we can alleviate the burden of the spelling and the punctuation and those kinds of things and keep them in the creative end of the exchange, it's often a much better result for our students. And
wholeheartedly agree.
Less discouraging. And it's the kids who absolutely want the first draft to be the final draft, those perfectionists among us, who are the ones who could most benefit from the process of learning to revise and edit. And like we said in our conversation last week, I think parents sometimes miss the boat because we think we're in teacher mode. So we're going to correct all the spelling and the punctuation and the grammar all at once. So can you talk about how it would be better for a parent to choose how to edit instead of editing all the things at once?
Yes. When you're teaching your kids, you're introducing skills, you're introducing concepts, you're modeling for them. Editing happens after your children have done the writing, and you're helping your kids sharpen those skills. So first, I just want to encourage you, you may not have the confidence in your own writing ability. You may think, well, I was never taught, or I'm not a good writer, or I don't know how to grade a paper. You may not have a background in English. It doesn't matter. You can still learn. There are tools to help you. When when you are working with your kids, I don't want to lose my train of thought, but I'm going to end up just kind of sharing things that are on my mind, and then hopefully I'll catch everything I want to say. But there are things to think about when you're editing a child's paper. First of all, kids are so emotionally attached to their writing. It is not like a math paper or a grammar activity, because there's emotion and labor. Writing can be so labor intensive for kids, especially if they struggle to hold a pencil. And like Ben, he would get arm cramps, and he couldn't cross the midline with his pencil, or his writing would just go wonky. And so all of those things, like Gretchen was saying, they worry about every little thing. And so there's a lot of emotion attached to that little paragraph that you're looking at. And their heart is saying, if you criticize my writing, you're criticizing me. So how do you make it objective instead of subjective when you are grading? Because again, it's not like there's a right and wrong answer like a math paper. There are things you can do. For instance, age-appropriate checklists and rubrics are going to give you the reasonable expectation for that lesson, for that child's age or grade. If you're using RightShop, those are built into the curriculum. So they're going to be appropriate, and you will know this is what's on my rubric. That's how much correcting I can do. Mm-hmm. They are going to keep you focused and consistent. And above all, they're going to help you become trustworthy. If you are not being capricious and arbitrary with your kids, but you're being specific and you're knowing exactly what to look for because the checklists are guiding you, then your kids are going to start to realize that they can trust your suggestions because you're just not being mean mom. And you're also taking that emotional out, like me against you, you're removing that, because now it's your child's paper against the checklist standards for the lesson. It's not what I think you should have done, and here's why you did it all wrong. It's like, here's how we can help you grow in your writing. And so sincere praise is really an important part of the process. Out of the chute, you should be looking for things they did well, and not just the minute you read that first sentence, whip out the red pencil and start making marks.
I might have done that once or twice.
Yeah, we all have. We all have. But instead, like, read through this paper or this paragraph several times, get the big picture, and comment and validate their ideas and point out great word choices. Point out a strong sentence, help them identify things they did well. And that's one of the real strong suits of RightShop Junior, is the checklists and the proofreading sessions that you do together. Help your child learn to identify those things themselves. So try not to pick apart every mistake, try not to correct everything. With some kids, it's better to even if the checklist says, these are the things to look for. You know your child's sensitivities. You know your child's age and ability and emotional maturity. You know their writing experience. It may be that you have to pick your hills to die on. And maybe you're not going to make a big deal out of punctuation this time, but you're going to focus on the sentence structure. Maybe the sentences are just not put together well. Maybe their word choices, they just keep repeating words or choosing weak words. Those are simple things. And if I can give you any encouragement, it's this: you don't have to even fix or help them fix everything on that checklist. But if they're just working on a few things each time, their writing is going to improve. Over time, you're going to see progress. And you don't have to be perfect at this, and neither do they.
Kim, can you explain about that concept and that idea of building on a concept, starting very small and building on that?
One of the tools that we use in our writing classes, and also in part of the RightShop lessons is writing games that help kids develop some kind of a skill. And I've just noticed over the years that kids have a hard time with sentence structure. So you're going to find typically three kinds of writers: kids who cannot string four words together and who need tools so that they can expand short sentences into longer ones. You have kids who need help writing more concretely. They just use vague words, repeated words, like I mentioned before, and their writing is just boring. And then you have the ones who write long, rambling, convoluted, or awkward sentences, and they need to learn how to break that sentence down and rebuild it. So this little simple game exercise is something I think, Gretchen, you said you put in the show notes.
Yes, we're going to include this in the show notes, but I think it's so important and so valuable. I wanted you to talk a little bit about it.
Yes. And so basically you start with a really vague 2-word sentence. In this example, in the blog post, the example is "it moves." Well, when I ask you to think about what is doing the moving and how it's moving, you might be thinking of a snake slithering on the ground. I might be thinking of a box falling off a shelf. We have no idea what each other is thinking unless we're specific. So this kind of activity, you do one change at a time. So you write "it moves" on the whiteboard. Then you ask your child to help you think of a concrete, specific subject. Is it going to be the cat? Is it going to be Lucy's bike? Is it going to be Grandma's box? And that becomes it. So Grandma's box moves. Well, how does it move? We need a defining, concrete action verb. So it could slide. So you can brainstorm with your kids and write down words. How could Grandma's box move? It could slide, it could fall, it could drop. And you just write down 4 or 5 different ideas, and then you ask your child to pick one. And now your sentence says, Grandma's box slid or slides. Then you might want to have them change the tense to past tense, because that's usually how writing happens. Then you might want to replace weak verbs. Add stronger adjectives or adverbs to make the writing a little more interesting. So describe the box. Is it a cardboard box? Is it a heavy box? Is it an old box? And by adding those words one at a time and writing the whole sentence with the new word, they're slowly seeing the sentences expand. And then eventually you can help them, especially as they're older. If they're older kids, they can build the sentence further by answering those who, what, when, where questions. And you could throw in participial phrases or prepositions or, just lots of different ways that you can change the structure of the sentence. And what you're doing is helping your kids write more interesting sentences, more mature sentences, more varied sentences. So if the struggle is a long, awkward sentence, break it down to its subject-verb component, the main subject, the main verb. And then you're telling your child, we're not going to throw away all your ideas. We're just going to pull those in one at a time till the sentence makes sense. And so that's a way that you can do like backwards editing almost by reconstructing the sentence. So I don't know if that helps.
And I think that this is really valuable because the exercise is in your hands. The creativity is in the child's hands.
Yes.
So taking the pressure of the pencil out of their hands, you're writing it either on a piece of paper or a whiteboard or wherever you're writing it so that the student can attend to the process and not get caught up in the mechanics of the writing itself. And I think that makes a tremendous amount of difference. In our show notes, you will find the whole blog, and I think you'll find it to be tremendously enlightening because it gives you an opportunity to figure out how to construct a sentence that is engaging and illustrative of this example. And it really does serve as a combination lock to help kids unlock more sentence creativity. So I think it will really be a blessing for families to be able to see that. I'd like to turn my attention now to the questions that I have here, because man, we had some really terrific questions, and the show notes that include the blogs are kind of tailored to answer some of these questions. But one of these that I thought was particularly interesting was tips to make writing skills fun. And I know that's sometimes writing and fun are anathema to each other. So
Yeah.
how do you, one of the things that I thought of is an exercise that we did with my kids when we were learning a poetry unit, and we would find a poem that they liked, and then I would ask them to mimic it with different different verbs, different nouns, but in the same style as whoever wrote those materials. And I was having a conversation yesterday in preparation for this conversation today, and I wondered what was said to me by my colleague was, make sure you ask him some of the things that she has incorporated over the years to make writing a fun experience. I know one of those things is kids get to write about what they choose to write about. So can you elaborate on that a little bit?
I've always found that to be one of the keys to successful teaching of writing, because I've seen and used writing curriculum that said, describe your bedroom, or describe a pencil, or something along that line. And if that doesn't strike a chord with a child, they're not going to give it their all. If they will complain, they'll fight, much more so than if they have sway over the topic. So I know that it really helps if you have a framework. So it's not just, and one of the biggest obstacles to teaching writing for kids, not to teaching, but for the child, is when you tell them write about whatever you want. Because then you have opened up Pandora's box, and they don't know anything. They don't know the parameters for the lesson. They don't know what topic they should pick. Instead, you give them directions. You give them a framework. Okay, we're going to describe an object, or we're going to explain a process of how to do something that you know how to do. But then they get to pick. So that's really important. If you have a child who's crazy for horses, or who loves Pokemon, or loves camping or hiking, whatever their interest, let them use that topic to write a personal narrative, to write about maybe make up a story, to describe the soccer ball, or tell an experience that happened to them when they were going on stage for their first recital. Whatever it is, they will have much more connection and be much more willing to write if they have a say in the topic.
I think that makes a tremendous amount of difference. I know I remember the curricula that we used, describe your room, and it was a 5-sentence essay that was so deadly boring. It was better than a sleep aid, to put you to sleep. But if you say to a child, describe your perfect place, that might be an easier way to take that same assignment and make it more inspirational, at least from their perspective.
Yeah.
I know that one of my children would have waxed eloquent all day long, every day, if he could have written every essay about dinosaurs when he was 8, 9, 10 years old. Unfortunately, the curriculum we used had a prescribed, we want you to write this and we want you to write that. And I think that kind of squashes kids' creativity a little bit, because
it really
they don't have an interest.
And you might get bored as a parent reading about dinosaurs every time your child puts a pencil to the paper. But if it's engaging them, their world will broaden over time.
Right. I remember well, one of the essays one of my kids had to write had to do with baseball. And no one in my family has an interest in baseball. So we actually had to go, maybe we should understand a little bit how the game is played. It was a really long, ugly experience to write an essay. So kind of hard to make that happen.
Yeah. Yeah.
Tell me
I
a little bit
remember
about
that exact book.
tell me a little bit about suggestions you might have for a student who has writer's block.
Oh gosh. Well, I think one thing is to give them some direction. That's going to help them. Help them to start small. It's not realistic for them to write a brilliant composition right out the chute. So encourage them, like especially if they're younger, but you can do this with teens as well. Not write a paragraph, but write stacked sentences so that each sentence is on its own line or a couple of lines, and then they've got something that they can isolate and work with. So if they start with the basics, like I am on a baseball team. Yesterday we played our best game. I drove in 2 runs. You can work with that. You can go back to the It Moves game and you can begin to help your child build out that sentence. Who were you on a baseball team with? What is the name of your baseball team? And then that suddenly, I am on the Red Rockets baseball team with my friend Gabriel. And so that gives them more to say without having to initially come up with all of that. So just trust the process that the first draft is not meant to be the final draft. And that's where you get to work things through. So that's one thing I would suggest. Another thing is to just let them get it written. They don't have to do all the writing now. They can just make mistakes, get it out on paper, fumble along through it a little bit. The revising is the more important part of the writing process. There will always be tweaking that has to happen with the first draft. But if they labor over every sentence as they're writing it, they're never going to get done. Just get the ideas out. And then another thing is that it's okay, especially with older kids, if they need to write out of order, like you can always reorganize things later on. So writer's block is sometimes because they don't know where to start. They don't know how to finish. They can just jump in somewhere and start writing. And then you can come back and add a topic sentence, or you can wrap it up later. With kids, to make it more fun is, just make games out of it. Like take something like, I'm sitting at my husband's desk, so I don't have anything really fun, but he's got a keychain here. And you could say, so do you remember when we went to visit Uncle Ben in England? And so you can have an object, or you can collect different objects. Like this was one thing that I used to do with my kids when they were small, is they would pick objects out of a junk drawer, and they would start their story based on that object, and then they'd have to take another object, and then they'd have to add to the story. So that is, if you're just wanting to write a silly story, or just then what happened, so they're using things like that. Asking them the questions, the who, what, whens, those are always going to be really important. Helping them write to music, putting on instrumental music for background so they're not distracted, but it can kind of give them some.
I think what you've given us here is permission as parents to step into that real editor mode of asking questions, instead of saying you didn't do this right, or
Yes.
you missed this point, or you didn't follow the rubric. Instead, being in a curious mode of saying, tell me more about this here, or tell me about your friend Gabriel on the Red Rockets baseball team. What does Gabriel look like, et cetera, et cetera.
Yes.
The things allow kids to begin to step into the descriptive end of the equation and it doesn't seem so intimidating. So I think that makes it really helpful.
Yeah, and then using writing prompts can be really helpful too.
Can you give
Like
me an example? I'm going to put you on the spot here, but parents may not understand what a writing prompt is. So,
Oh, okay. So a writing prompt is basically just a jump start into a topic. So it could be silly, like, would you rather be bald or have lettuce for hair? And then tell why, or, and it doesn't have to become a writing prompt, doesn't have to become a story, but it might. Um, there are hundreds of free writing prompts on the Write Shop blog, and they're often topical. So writing prompts about the beach, writing prompts um, about friends, writing prompts about pets, and so you can just go through and find writing prompts that will just get you started. But another thing is finding great photos. What's happening in this picture? Who, what, when, where, why? So like beautiful photos out of a magazine or online. You can find these incredible nature photos, and maybe there's somebody in the photo who's like, you see this little bicycle on a ridge up in a desert somewhere, and you don't know anything, but your child can dream up a story. So having something that's a springboard to writing is basically the purpose of a writing prompt.
one of the things I used to do with my kids, and this could come back to haunt you, so I tell this story a little cautiously. We used to go when we would go out in public, and we were the homeschool generation that if somebody said, well, why aren't you all in school today? We'd say field trip, because we didn't want to get caught at home educating. But the truth of the matter was I would take them out and I would say, all right, yeah, we're in a mall. You see that lady walking towards us, tell me a story about her. And in that context, we're not writing anything down. I'm just asking them to think creatively. And some of those stories were wild and they were hilarious. And it was very entertaining. But what that does is it think creatively. And when you ask them to sit down and think creatively in a writing context, it becomes easier for them to do.
Absolutely.
And
I love that.
sometimes those stories were like, okay, we're going to stop this story now. But it was always entertaining, and it allowed them to think in a more creative context. I have 5 college graduates, and 4 of them are in fields that require a degree of creative composition, even now as adults. So I think it was worth doing that more frequently. Any opportunity you can have to have your child think creatively, I think makes for a better writing experience. And Kim, you had talked about words and wordplay. I know in my family, in our reading endeavors, every child was required to come to the table with a word they had found in their reading that day that they didn't understand. And so consequently, we had a vocabulary lesson over the dinner table pretty much every night. And I think that's a terrific way to be able to help kids find words that they can then use later. Even a cheap $2 notebook where they can write the words that they find down so that they can use them later is a terrific place to be able to do that.
And I had mentioned the thesaurus, and they have children's thesauruses, and they have, for adults. And it's nice to teach your kids to use a book thesaurus, even though it's so easy to go onto thesaurus.com. And I'm not saying don't do that, but it's really nice to also teach them to use physical tools. But that's one amazing way to increase your kids' vocabularies, because they may know some basic words. They just don't know other ways to express those words. So, they may know the word run, but they wouldn't think about using the word jog, and they may know the word jog. It just doesn't come to the top of their mind when they're writing to use jog or sprint or race or, just dart. And so these are words that we may think of readily, and they may even know them. But a thesaurus is going to trigger. It's not a cheat, it's a tool. And the same thing with scribing for your kids. It's not cheating, it's giving them a leg up until they are capable of doing it on their own. It lets them focus on their ideas without the added stress. Yeah.
Absolutely. One of the things that several parents said to us is, how do you deal with procrastination? And I have a black belt in that. If it wasn't for the last minute, I'd never get anything done. So I certainly understand and empathize with these parents. When you have a writing assignment, how do you get the genie out of the bottle? How do you uncork that creativity when a child really is procrastinating?
One of the things that I found really helped for my kids who were procrastinators was it just wasn't enough to say. And I'm thinking to my older kids who were old enough to be able to, like they were high schoolers. It was not enough for me to say, I want you to read X book and write a book report on it and have it to me in 2 weeks and give them a deadline. I needed to say, on this day, I want to see, you need to have read this many chapters or this many pages or whatever. So giving them deadlines through the reading if they needed it.
Mhm.
My girls were such avid readers, they did not need to be prodded to read. But one of my daughters in particular was very much a procrastinator. And so I would have to say, okay, I want to see your book report outline on this day. I want to see the rough draft on this day. And I'm assuming, this would be for, like, if it's just a book report and it's just going to be, you just want to see that they got the ideas. But if it's something that actually needs to go through the writing process, and they're just going to hand you their first draft on the due date after whipping it up that morning or the night before, I'm talking about something that really needs to be, they need to show you their brainstorming. They need to show you their first draft. They need to show you their self-editing. You need to work through the editing process with them. And then they need, and you give them deadlines. Okay, so tomorrow you need to have your brainstorming for me. So you look it over and you say, oh gosh, you've got a lot of great ideas on here, but I'm afraid you're going to run short of topics to write about on this subject. You might need to do a little more brainstorming, or you're going to get stuck on your writing day. Then on the writing day, they do their writing and say, okay, now I want you to write it today and edit it on Monday. And so they have the weekend for it to rest, which is really important with writing. Then on Monday, they self-edit with their own personal checklist, and then they give it to me. So now I've got a day to edit it, and then I give it back to them. So you keep them accountable with mini due dates along the way. And by breaking the process down into steps, like that big jump example, you're not just asking them to turn in a final paper, you're asking them to do little steps that lead up to the top of the castle.
And I think that's a life skill that's great for us to master at any age.
Yes.
I know that for me, being able to break it down into manageable bites makes a tremendous amount of difference, even as an adult who's been doing writing and creative writing for 50 years.
Yeah.
It makes a tremendous amount of difference when we can see an end goal and sort of work backwards. How am I going to make this work? And if we can model that for our kids, maybe in your earlier example, you need to literally come alongside a child and help them brainstorm and help them begin that draft and do those things until they're ready to take ownership and do that for themselves. I cannot believe we're up to the last 5 minutes today already. Kim, what are your closing thoughts for our families today?
Oh, gosh. Well, I just want you to be encouraged that writing is a process. It's not a one-time event. It's a lifetime learning skill, and your children are going to love it or hate it, but they have to learn to do it. And so look for the ways to make it as engaging as you can. I just love the fun activities in the primary and junior Write Shop materials that make writing so much fun that the kids don't even realize they're learning. And that is kind of a gift to you as a parent, but also to your child. Back off on expectations that are unreasonable for your kids and let them play and make mistakes and learn and grow. Do hands-on things with them. But the biggest hurdle you're going to come across is going to be for these kids who struggle to get their words out independently. And I just want to encourage you that no matter who writes them down, they're still your child's words. You are going to run the narrative through your head that you are enabling them, you are handicapping or cheating or whatever it is. It's still your child's words. Whether you are Aristotle or the Apostle Paul or the President of the United States, you're dictating your words to somebody and they're writing them down. Nobody says that Tertius wrote the book of Romans. You know, it was Paul. And yet he had a scribe because by that point in his life, he was not able to do the writing independently. Same with your kids. Just because you do the writing doesn't mean it's not their words. So that'll help take away the battle and the hours spent with writing. It'll help to give your child some flexibility and freedom. They'll be more free to be creative because they're not limited to, it's like my son used to say, I'd say, okay, we picked all these great words. Which words do you want to use? Which two do you want to pick for your adjectives? Which ones are shortest to write? Well, if you're scribing for your child, you'll get the best words. When you've got a struggling writer whose hand hurts or who has tactile issues or can't get their thoughts together. So I don't know. That's always my top tip for parents with a struggling writer.
And I think in that context, as a parent, the important thing is to remember that it's their words. So while they're talking, don't say, oh, don't you mean navy blue? Or don't you mean azure instead of blue? Just capture what they're saying, and then you can walk back through the editorial process because it makes all the difference in the world for kids. Kim, I want to thank you so much for joining me today. It has been my very great pleasure to spend this time with you yet again. And I appreciate you taking a step back from your retirement to step back into your writer's shoes to give our parents some insight today, because it's been a very special treat. This is Gretchen Rowe for the Demi Learning Show, and I want to thank you all for joining us today. You can access the show notes and watch the recording at demilearning.com/show, or you can view it on our YouTube channel. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe wherever you may be hearing this information, especially if you really enjoyed it. Thanks for joining us today, everyone. Have a joyful afternoon.